Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Xero tip. So for most of you, this month, being March, is the last month of your financial year. So come April, you'll be sending in your details to your accountant to start the process for preparing your accounts. What I'm going to cover off today are some things that you can do in your Xero file now, or potentially in April, to get your file ready for that account stage. I'm also going to go through a couple of things that you can do in your Hubdoc file to help prepare for year end as well. So the first thing I'm going to go into is your invoices. So these are your invoices that you're sending out to your customers. Now, one of the first things to look for is, do you have any draft invoices or invoices sitting in awaiting approval? So if you do have invoices sitting in here, while they won't be in your sales list or anything like that, if they do sit there and you push them through and keep the same date that they'll currently have, they will cause changes in your debtors for the financial year that we're currently in. So go through these, clear out any that you have, either push them into awaiting payment or delete them, just so that that list is tidy and doesn't cause any changes later. Going into your awaiting payment list. So in this list, it will show you all of your invoices that you're waiting for payment. Now, you may have potentially some old ones here, like this one here I can see that's overdue by 78 days. If you don't expect to receive payment for this invoice, then what I'd suggest you do is put through a bad debt transaction. To do that, click on the invoice and then go to Invoice Options, Add Credit Note, and then change the code from sales to bad debts or something like that, whatever you have set up in your system. And make sure that when you're putting this through that it is dated within the financial year. So if you're doing this in April, make sure you backdate this to 31 March, just so that that debtor is cleaned up in the correct financial year. Otherwise, if you are expecting to receive payment for those invoices, I suggest following up those customers to ensure that they pay you sooner rather than later. The other thing to also consider is just check that the invoices are marked as sent, because if they haven't been sent, it's likely that the customer may have never received that invoice, so you might need to follow that one up. The other thing to consider is whether to use invoice reminders. This is an automated system that Xero uses to send reminders to your customers if they are overdue with their invoices. This is something that might be worth looking at if you do have a number of overdue debtors. Okay, so that's the sales side. If we go into the purchaser side, just like with sales, if you have any bills that are in draft or awaiting approval, make sure you clean out any ones that relate to the current financial year, just so that they don't cause any differences later. Going into awaiting payment, just check that this list is still accurate. I'd suggest that at the end of 31st of March, if you're not in the habit of doing this already, if you receive statements from your suppliers, go through and just check that the supplier statement that you've received matches the amount that you've got in your system. As long as it matches, then everything in here should be fine. If it doesn't, look into it, maybe look through the history of that particular supplier's transactions in your Xero file, or perhaps you could look at or discuss this with the supplier and find out if there's bills they haven't sent you for whatever reason. Now, if you prepare your own GST returns, going to Accounting and GST Return, the key thing that you want to make sure you've done here is that all your GST returns for the current financial year are set as locked. Now, this is just the demo file, so it's prompting me to set it up. You won't get this window. But just make sure that you don't have any returns showing in the due now. Do make sure that you do this after 31st of March, because of course your March GST return will show up in here after this particular date. But just make sure all your other returns are marked as final, and that just means that Xero has locked down those GST periods, and if there are any changes, they'll be pushed through into the late claims for the next return. Couple of other things within Xero, just make sure that your banks are fully reconciled. So As at the 31st of March, make sure all transactions have been coded across all of your bank accounts. Just check you don't have a message down here that says if there's any hidden bank accounts. If you do have any of those, just make sure you click on that button to review all bank accounts to make sure all March transactions are coded. And lastly, if you have any assets or loans or new transactions like this that you've taken, that you've drawn down over the past financial year, go into those transactions and just make sure that you've attached any relevant documents to them. So if you know you purchased an asset, you can go into that particular transaction. Just pick on this one here. And just make sure that you've attached any relevant documentation using the attached document symbol. If you're using Hubdoc, hopefully you would have put the document through there and to create the transaction in Xero, so that side of things should already be done. If you've taken out any new loans, you can attach the loan documentation to the transaction in here as well. Otherwise, just make sure you've got it filed somewhere safely to give to your accountant. Now, for those of you using Hubdoc, there's a couple of things that you can do to get this ready as well. The main thing here is to go to your Failed tab in Hubdoc and just make sure it looks like this and says that there's no documents to be found. If there are any documents in there, just check to see whether it's email signature or something else that's not relevant, and delete it out. If it's a transaction that hasn't been able to be processed and it relates to the current financial year, go into it, check that you haven't loaded it manually, otherwise push it through to Xero so that it can be cleaned up. For those of you with use of home claims, you can store your use of home documents within Hubdoc, which makes it easy for your accountant to access them. So to do this, the first step is in your tags, click on the plus new tag and put use of home 2022 or something similar. It looks something like this. So you can see I've got some other examples that I've done previously. If there's any transactions that you've got that relate to that use of home claim, just going back to my all list. So this one here, you can go to add tag and then type in tag that document. And that just means it stores it in that folder. Now, if you pay for this cost privately, once you've added the tag, click archive, and this will prevent it going across to Xero. So this is something you don't have to do at year end. You can do it throughout the year for any costs that you want to claim for use of home later. Submit them into Hubdoc. Make sure you've got a tag over here to use and click add tag to add it to that list. And then most importantly, if it's not a transaction that's gone through your Xero file, make sure you hit archive so that it doesn't go through to Xero by mistake. Hope that all makes sense, and hopefully that will help get your files nice and tidy, ready for your 2022 accounts.